Hello, I'm Philip Chase. Welcome to my YouTube channel on the best of fantasy. In today's video, I will be reviewing A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This is the first book in the Shades of Magic series, which includes the already published A Gathering of Shadows, as well as A Conjuring of Light. Now, A Darker Shade of Magic is pretty much self-contained, with a narrative that feels more or less complete. Although there are some loose ends that might be hints of what's to come in the future books, especially regarding the identities of the two main characters. I have seen A Darker Shade of Magic billed as both YA and as an adult fantasy, and so that's something I actually want to talk about a little bit because I think there are some larger issues at play here, including the fact that whether or not a book gets billed as YA, often there's some sort of politics involved in that, and they are often gendered politics with a lot of women authors being lumped into YA. And so that's something I want to just briefly talk about because I also think that there are some important differences when it comes to YA versus adult fantasy. And for me, it's more than just whether or not there's violence or sex involved in the narrative. To me, it actually boils down to complexity. Complexity of the characters, complexity of themes, complexity of sentence structure and vocabulary. These are all things that matter in terms of whether or not something is YA or adult. Readers below a certain age might find too much complexity to be boring, whereas readers above a certain age would find the lack of complexity to be less engaging. And so that's an important distinction. Of course, there is no clear boundary between YA and adult. The line is pretty blurry, in fact. And by the way, I do not think it's a negative thing to say that a book is YA. I actually think there's a very important place for YA books, and I personally have read quite a few of them. Sometimes I read them along with my daughters, and sometimes I read them for myself. So it's not to me a negative thing to say that a book is YA, but if you describe a book as an adult fantasy and it's really more YA, I don't think it serves the book. And in the particular case of A Darker Shade of Magic, I think the book would be better served if it were described as YA. Now, perhaps you could say it's more on the mature side of YA, since there's a fair amount of violence, a lot of bloodshed in the book. But nevertheless, in terms of complexity, I think it's a better fit to call it YA and create the right set of expectations in a reader to begin with. Now I'd like to talk about the setting, which is kind of one of the more fun aspects of the book to me. The book is primarily set in London. Well, I should say Londons because there are 4 of them, beginning with Grey London, which is our London, more or less, the year 1819. So King George III, in his later years, is ruling over England. And so Grey London, that's the name that one of the main characters has for our London. It's named Grey because it's not magical. Magic has been forgotten or has fallen into disuse, so it's mostly gone. And our London is kind of boring compared to the other ones. And then there's Red London, where magic is in balance with humanity, and it is more or less thriving. So there's a lot of magic being used there, and that is where one of our main characters comes from. And then there is White London. This is a place that is kind of starved for resources, starved for magic, and it's not a very nice place. It's a place where the strong prey on the weak. And so, yeah, not a pleasant place to be. And finally, there's Black London. Now, something really went wrong in Black London. Nobody actually goes there anymore. Magic has taken over. It's a complete imbalance where magic totally took over. There are 2 main characters, kind of dual protagonists, if you will, who are fairly well developed. And one of them is Kell, the person from Red London that I mentioned earlier. Kell is an Antari. In fact, he's one of the 2 remaining Antari. And these are individuals who are powerful enough in magic, specifically in blood magic, that they are able to travel between the worlds. And so Kell serves as a kind of messenger from Red London to the other Londons. and he's an asset, more or less, of the royal family in Red London. They maintain a fiction that Kell is part of the royal family, but really he's more of a tool. And though he is deeply loyal, especially to Prince Ree, he commits small acts of rebellion in an attempt to forge a little bit of an identity for himself. And this is also because of the absence of his childhood memories. These little acts of rebellion include smuggling small items from the other Londons, and this habit, if you will, takes on major implications, which I won't get into because I want to avoid spoilers for the video. Kell is basically a naive but likable character, and he also has a really cool coat. The other major character here is Delilah Bard, and she's from our London, Grey London. She is a survivor. She's street smart, and she's got a bit of a vicious streak that hides the fact that she has a heart that is capable of loyalty and good. She commits a few acts that, honestly, if she'd been a male character, I think a lot of readers would have found hard to forgive. For example, at one point, she sexually humiliates another character. But I think we're more or less meant to understand that she's coming from a very rough background. And part of her journey is discovering that she's not as mercenary as she would like to think. With the possible exception of Holland, who is the other Antari in the book, and I won't get into his character too much, but he's kind of conflicted for reasons that I don't want to mention because it would be a spoiler. But with the exception of Holland, the other characters are, for the most part, flat. They are undeveloped props, more or less. It's the baddies in the story, the Dane twins, who are the rulers of White London. They're really thinly sketched tropes, more or less like statues, and they're not particularly interesting, to be honest, and they don't seem to be motivated by anything more complex than just wanting to dominate. They're also introduced fairly late in the narrative, which doesn't help in terms of their development. And speaking of fairly late, the plot doesn't really snap into focus until pretty late in the book, and then it's over really fast. In spite of the book's quick finish, I would say that the plot is overall a bit of a weakness. There are just too many coincidences that are vaguely explained away by magic. And there are several types of magic that exist in these worlds. One, as I mentioned earlier, is blood magic, which the Antari alone are capable of using, but there's also elemental magic, and then there's the kind of magic that comes out of Black London. And none of them are particularly really well explained. Honestly, with magic being so central to the plot, it would have been nice to have more details about the workings of the magical systems. Magical things just seem to happen to serve the moment. Now, to be honest, I'm not really sure whether or not I'm going to continue with the series. There's just enough there, I think, that I would consider it, particularly if I were to hear from people who have read books 2 and 3, and if they're enthusiastic about them, then I could see myself continuing. So I'd really like to know what you think if you have read those books, and if you love the series, tell me about that and why you love them. Leave some comments, that would be great. And tell me if you think I'm missing something in my analysis here. Perhaps you disagree with the book being categorized as YA, although I honestly feel that that categorization best serves the book. In my upcoming videos, I'm going to be talking about the origins of fantasy, so be on the lookout for that one. And I started reading my next book for review, and that is a book from Germany called The Elven. I'm really looking forward to getting further into that. So far, I like it a lot. Also, if you're interested in great fantasy and discussing it, then please consider liking and subscribing to my channel, and I hope to see you for my next videos. Until next time.